So I might as well get to that. I'm so excited to hear Lori talk about her work and to hear all the comments. So let's do this. Welcome everybody to Labor's Big Book Forum for the year. Every year we at the Journal choose one book recently published or about to be published, one that we see as particularly important and cutting edge for this forum. And this year we've chosen Lori Flores's Awaiting Their Feast, Latinx Food Workers and Activism from World War II to COVID-19. I just so enjoyed reading this book and the contribution that it's making. We have a great team of editors at Labor, and we talk collaboratively about the books coming out in making this decision, and it was an easy choice this year. Last year, for example, we chose Margot Canaday's book, Queer Career, and the published roundtable just came out in September of this year. The discussion today will give everybody who's speaking today a chance to kind of revise and polish their comments and then ask Lori to respond to them. And that will then be a published roundtable in a future issue of the journal. So we're very excited to have this stellar group coming together to discuss Lori Flores's book with us. And thank you all for being here as well. I'm going to turn things over now to one of our senior associate editors, Jessie Wilkerson. She, along with Jeanette Garrett-Scott and Alex Dunphy and Patrick Dixon, are really the team that work with me at the Journal. Jessie Wilkerson is the Stuart and Joyce Robbins Associate Professor of History at West Virginia University, and she serves as Senior Associate Editor for the Journal Labor. Take it away, Jessie.
Thanks, Julie, and hello to everyone. As we were all getting on the call, we were saying this is exactly the place we want and probably need to be right now. So I especially want to thank Lori for the opportunity to dive into her new, very wonderful book, and to all of our commenters who've joined today. So I'm going to moderate today's event. And I'll start with introductions, and then we'll hand things over to Lori to discuss her book, and then I'll introduce our commenters, and they will share with us their insights. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured author for this year's Labor Big Book Forum, Lori A. Flores, who is an associate professor of history and director of the Latinx American and Caribbean Studies Center and Program at Stony Brook University. Today, of course, Professor Flores will discuss her highly anticipated book, Awaiting Their Feast, Latinx Food Workers and Activism from World War II to COVID-19, which will be published by UNC Press in January 2025. The book traces how the United States' dual appetite for Latinx food and Latinx food labor evolved from World War II to COVID. To augment the book, Professor Flores also co-created a digital history project called the Mexican Restaurants of New York City, which is a story map. And it provides a digital history of how Mexican food spread throughout New York City's boroughs from the 1930s to the present. And I got to check out that story map, and it's really cool, so I highly recommend it. Professor Flores's first book, Grounds for Dreaming, Mexican Americans, Mexican Immigrants, and the California Farm Worker Movement, analyzed the historical relationships between Mexican Americans, braceros, and undocumented immigrants in their struggles for civil and labor rights in California's Salinas Valley. It was named a Best First Book by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, Best History Book by the International Latino Book Awards, and winner of the Historical Society of Southern California's Martin Ridge Award, among others. She is also the co-editor of the new revised edition of the Academic's Handbook, published by Duke University Press, and it's an anthology that is full of wise, accessible essays about navigating academia. Professor Flores has received numerous fellowships, including from the Russell Sage Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy, the Huntington Library, the Bionic Library, and the Ford Foundation. She has also recently been named an OAH Distinguished Lecturer for 2023-2026. So our program will begin with Professor Flores providing us a 10-minute overview of her book. Lori, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Thank you to Julie. Thank you to Alex, the whole team at Labor. I have been reading Labor since I was a grad student and book reviewing for the journal, and it's such a profound honor to be picked as the book to be discussed in the forum this year. And I'm trying to keep myself from crying at looking at the names here on my Zoom because it's friends, it's colleagues, it's family, it's so many people that have supported this work and me as a person in the last 7 years of researching and writing it. So thank you all for taking time out of your Friday to be here. Thank you so much to the commentators who agreed to do this. It's not easy to read and to really think about and to comment on someone's work, and so I'm so appreciative. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the book and how I came to writing it, and I'll keep an eye on the time so that we stay on track. Thank you for mentioning the first book, Grounds for Dreaming, because this second book, Awaiting Their Feast, was a natural outgrowth of the interests I already had. So Grounds for Dreaming stayed within the realm of agricultural labor and the farm worker movement. And it was about California because that's where I was living at the time in grad school. So when I was thinking about this next work, I have to admit, I felt lost for a while in terms of thinking about what would hold my interest for the next almost decade, and what could still play on my strong suits, but be different enough that I would stay interested in, that I would challenge myself, and also that I would produce something interesting for my students and other students working in Latinx immigration, labor, and what would come to be food history. So I knew I wanted to stick to my passions that I still had for labor and immigration history and Latino history, and I still wanted to think about how intra-ethnic relationships between different groups of Latinx people, and this book expanded to a lot more people from the Caribbean as well, how they navigated their relationships in the workplace and in daily life. And I knew that I still wanted to pay attention to what difference place made in a story and in a history of workers. And I knew I still had things to say about farm workers, but I thought the way that this book could be different was by talking about many different links in the food chain, centering farm workers still, but then also talking about what happens once the food leaves the fields and the canning factories, and when it makes its way to our grocery stores, our places of sociality, our plates on our tables. And so this book taught me a lot about workers that I wasn't able to write about in the first book, and it also taught me about different groups of Latinx communities in a region that I had come to live in, which was the Northeast. So now that I've been teaching on the East Coast for a dozen years, I've learned so much from my students. They have represented the diversity that was always here on the East Coast, but gradually making its way to a lot of different regions of the United States. A lot more Caribbean students, a lot more Central American and South American students that I was teaching in my classrooms. And a lot of the times, their questions about themselves, their own routes, their own families' histories, the historiography wasn't really keeping up with their questions and their curiosities. And I'm heartened to see more work coming out about these communities and expanding Latinx history beyond older historiography, which focused a lot on Mexican and Puerto Rican origin communities and now has expanded in wonderful ways. And I wanted to write a book that could help speak to my students here at Stony Brook and in the Northeast and in the US more generally. And the things that I say about the Northeast in this book, some are unique to the region, but I think many things are not unique and we can see happening in different parts of the country. So I really hope that Awaiting Their Feast can be helpful to a lot of students and scholars and the general public interested in food and immigration and labor. I really believe, I've come to believe over the course of researching this book, because I had to get into food studies, a whole other literature that I wasn't so well versed in, but had to become well versed in to be able to dialogue with that group of scholars. I've come to believe that when food studies pays attention to labor, and when labor studies pays attention to food, you get very fascinating results when it comes to historical study. And so I'm very grateful to the work that's been done in food studies and ethnic studies and immigration studies, because it's really taught me a lot. And so this book has been very stimulating, very challenging to write, because it was trying to dialogue with two what can often be very siloed forms of scholarship. But I think we are seeing more works that bridge those fields, food, labor, immigration, and ethnic studies. The Northeast to me made sense also, not just because I live here, but because it's a region that's been relatively understudied in Latinx history. It has been a profoundly Latino region for a really long time, for centuries. And it's also part of this other borderland zone that more and more people are talking about, our borderland with Canada, but the ways in which labor and immigration problems are playing out in this other border zone are just as pressing as what is happening at our southern border with Mexico, because a lot of people are coming straight to the northern borderlands or starting their stories in these northern borderlands in ways that are specifically a 20th and 21st century phenomenon in a lot of ways. So that makes the Northeast very interesting, especially around this time of year. The tourism and the artisanal food cultures that not just Northeasterners, but people around the US consume. A lot of these commodities that will be on people's Thanksgiving tables, or a lot of the commodities that we're ingesting when we tour, New England, or sort of take part in autumnal activities that invoke New England. If you think about apple cider, or blueberry pie, or Maine lobster, all of these things are coming from the Northeast, and in a couple of months, wreaths for the holidays, are other commodities that all of these are commodities that are powered and made possible by the labor of so many people from Latin America and the Caribbean and US-born descendants with histories in those places. So Awaiting Their Feast has two through lines running through it. It's not quite a book about just the commodities, and it's not a book quite just about the workers. It's trying to do this dual examination of how we in the United States have become a nation which has been very obsessed and eager with consuming both Latinx foodways, Latin American foodways, specifically Mexican food, and consuming the labor as well. But in the course of the sort of post-World War II time period, from the 1940s to COVID, which is a weird bookend to have, but it does make sense given what COVID did to expose the food chain and its linkages and its breaking, is that we are also a nation that has gotten so used to importing and benefiting from multiple flows of Latin American and Caribbean labor, whether it's undocumented or legally contracted, or US-born descendants of these places. From the World War II period on, we, as a nation, have devalued both things in tandem, the food and the workers, at the same time that we have become even more obsessed with consuming them. So this book is trying to show how that process happened, from a historical grounding, from taking case studies in different states in the Northeast, moving the reader through time, but using sort of a nucleus case study in a Northeastern state, an industry, to be able to show how both things are happening at once, that people are benefiting from the cultural and the culinary transformations, that Latinx, US Latinx, Latin American and Caribbean peoples have brought and contributed to Northeastern places and US places writ large. But then at the same time, how discourses around such things as authenticity. It's only real Mexican food if it's cheap. This is a very damaging discourse that I think over time has converged with rhetoric around immigrant labor being cheap. And especially if you get more immigrants in the food precariat, in the food work precariat, then these discourses become intertwined and almost inescapable. But what I will conclude by saying is that the book is not all about victimization. It's not all about people suffering under these tandem devaluations happening with the food and the people. But it does try to lift out moments where food workers try to articulate their hunger, both physical hunger because they are food insecure and underpaid and have a lack of access to nutrition while they're working, but also their emotional hunger for more dignity in the workplace, more dignity in daily life, more respect, and the moments in which they articulated these hungers and then fought to have them visible, heard, and improved in some way. So at the same time, I'm trying to point out all the failures that have happened over time and all of the damaging discourses that the various industries, the federal government, governments at multiple levels, and especially during the Trump years, we saw a lot of changes in the food industry and a lot of hypocrisy around praising the food and vilifying the people. And so this book is not only addressing the disappointment in that and how it should be corrected, we can course correct, but it's also showing how food workers have never been silent that whole time, that they have been fighting, they have been articulating their needs, and they have been nourishing themselves and their communities. So it makes me happy we're in community today. And I'll end with that. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Lori, for a really excellent preview of your book. So we're going to turn now to our commenters, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. And also I wanted to mention to our commenters, Alex is going to give you a 2-minute warning in the chat. He'll send you a note just so you're aware of the time. So we'll start with Nan Enstad, who is professor and chair of community and environmental sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has written 2 books, Ladies of Labor, Girls of Adventure, Popular Culture and Labor Politics, and Cigarettes, Inc., A Cultural History of Corporate Imperialism. She moved from the UW History Department to the Ag School in 2020 because her new project is on agriculture and food, which I am so curious about your experience, Nan. Our next speaker will be Laura Anne Minkoff-Zern, who is an associate professor of geography and the environment and graduate director of food studies at Syracuse University. She's the author of The New American Farmer, Immigration, Race, and the Struggle for Sustainability. And she's now working on a book about labor across food sectors, exploring at the intersections between social movements in US food systems and labor organizing. Stephen Pitti is a professor of history, American studies, and ethnicity, race, and migration at Yale, where he teaches and writes about Latinx history. He's the author of The Devil in Silicon Valley, Race, Mexican Americans in Northern California, which came out in 2003. And he's currently working on 2 book projects, The World of Cesar Chavez, forthcoming from Yale University Press, and Leaving California, Race from the Golden State. And then our final speaker will be Bryant Simon, who is the Laura H. Carnell Professor of History at Temple University. He's the author of 4 books about US history, most recently, The Hamlet Fire, a tragic story of cheap food, cheap government, and cheap lives, published by New Press in 2018. And I do want to mention that that book has been translated into Japanese recently. And his current project looks at the history of the public bathroom in the US over the last 120 years. So Nan, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Lori, for the great gift of this book at just this moment. The histories that Lori has researched and the stories she tells helps build a vision for the world that we want to see. And they help us build that world, not someday, but now as we meet the day that is upon us in struggle, solidarity, and love. I'm a little emotional this week. Politics is what we make between us and what we dare to imagine, to paraphrase Paul Wellstone. And Lori is a master storyteller and an urgent weaver of contexts. And she helps us imagine otherwise, and she gives us many specific resources to move forward in dangerous times. And it's these resources that I want to illuminate in my comments today. So my goal is not to critique this book. I think I'm done with that in this lifetime, to be honest. Critique, as it's typically practiced in academic spaces, too often serves mostly to prove the smarts of the critic. We've all seen that, not usually in this crowd. On the left, though, the more negative critique is too often taken as the keener and more radical stance, regardless of the content. And in our understandable but anxious obsession with finding the right answer, we sometimes trip over Enlightenment thinking. And so I'm reaching back before the Enlightenment to adapt the practice of illumination of manuscripts. The illuminator engages the text and adds their own embellishments and illustrations, first to make the meaning pop out more, right? But even more importantly, to enhance the action of the text, its transformative qualities and the impact on the readers, so that the next reader will experience the text personally. So I'm going to picture for you what to me is of particular value in this book, very idiosyncratic. And then I'm going to add my own thoughts and coloration about why I think it's useful for all of us. And then I'm going to tell you how it moved or changed me and how I feel that it has calls to action for us. This is a time for action. So value number 1, Lori takes as her frame Latinx workers, not just in a particular industry or node in the supply chain, but in the food system as a whole, as she explained. We learn about farm workers of many different kinds, including in the fishing industry, which I loved. But not only that, we also learn about food processors. We learn about restaurant workers. We learn about restaurant entrepreneurs. We learn about delivery drivers. We see that the whole food supply chain works because of Latinx workers, from farm production to first-order processing of agricultural products, to culinary and second-order processing, to distribution, to consumption. Workers all the way through. The fundamental structure of this book, because of that, yields great new knowledge. So I think this is valuable for us. And Lori mentioned this because she bridges the borders between food studies and labor history. And for those unfamiliar, it might not be so visible if you first read the book as a labor historian. It might not be immediately visible that Lori is in conversation with interdisciplinary food studies, literatures, and framings throughout the book. It was so exciting for me to read this. This reveals the deep importance and impact of Latinx workers to the entire system of food production and consumption that fuels the country and far beyond. Likewise, Lori's book gives us so much that is needed to food studies, which I'm now participating in as well, which has chronically paid too little attention to labor, some present company accepted there. Food studies, like any field, is not uniform, but it has been highly hampered by really individualized neoliberal solutions that are epitomized in the slogan, "Vote with your fork." Food studies is hungry for the kinds of structural analyses of labor that Lori provides. And this mashup of history, labor history, and food studies is a new magical beast. I am very happy to have met this beast, and I'm going to keep it with me now forever. So thank you, Lori, for that. How it changes me and how I feel that it's a call to action. I started thinking about how, as labor historians, how we might think about being interdisciplinary as being coalitional. Stop patrolling the borders of disciplines. We know that they are imaginary lines. We have so much to learn from other disciplines, and we need broadly interdisciplinary solutions to the problems that are intensifying now. Solutions that marry worker advocacy, food sovereignty, basic needs support, and deportation resistance. Labor history is one of the most publicly engaged branches of history, a field that's not all that publicly engaged, most often through allying with unionization efforts, but also other kinds of ways of being engaged. And I moved to food and egg studies because it's very engaged, and doing applied work is the norm. Everyone I've met working in applied food systems emphasizes the significance of storytelling or messaging to how campaigns unfold and how advocacy is pursued. Lori offers an amazing pathway for how labor history can provide coalition building within academics in ways that can make our work and our skill set more immediately useful and applicable to the problems that we face. So coalition building interdisciplinarily, and also with these kinds of applications that we're seeing campaigns outside the university. So much potential. So value number 2. Lori discovers that farm and food workers eat. Right? It's amazing that we would have to discover this. Of course, we know it, but by bringing those together in this study, it is so it has so much impact, right? So the first value that I just mentioned was that Lori uses the supply chain thinking, right, by tracing the supply chain and putting together the structure of her book. But here, Lori also resists the biggest pitfall of the supply chain model, and is one that dogs food studies. And that is the implication that the food chain or the supply chain moves from production to consumption, right? Farm to table. Are there no tables on the farms? Is what I ask my students. You know, there's no tables on the farms. Of course, that's just a construction. That's a model that was created partly by historians and other scholars, partly by capitalist distribution agents, for looking at how capitalism works. But by looking at how farm and food workers ate and wished to eat, Lori uncovers a vivid history of struggle for basic needs and for pleasure. Lori reveals that every point on the supply chain is a site of labor, the transformation and creation of value, and of consumption. And that the two together help us understand workers' politics. She shows that workers have regularly agitated for sufficient and culturally appropriate food. So why is this a value for us? How we imagine capitalist structures matters really deeply. The imaginary of a chain from production to consumption reifies a fictional consumer who does not produce, right? So I'm going to talk about Bryant Simon, but I'm going to let him talk about himself. and skip a little bit. I've been reading a little slowly. So the call to action here is to look at politics and pleasure, and that these two questions that are simple actually can bust up dominant bourgeois political economy. At every node of the supply chain, how do people labor, and how do these Latinx laborers want to eat? And I just have a minute left, so let me outline my third value. I won't have time to explain it. You're gonna have to read it. In labor. So finally, the rising popularity of Mexican food, part of a labor story. That is amazing. I love that. It's really, really important. There's a whole history, kind of study in food studies with Ajahn Appadurai about nationalism and food that Lori is tapping in on and wrapping around with. I see in this work a real call for a potential to unify with La Via de Campesina, an international organization that is calling for food sovereignty for peoples around the world. I saw so much of that language in the frameworks that Lori is using. And we're going to really need some international organizing. So I feel like there's something very visionary in what Lori is doing and bringing together the culinary history and workers' agitation for culturally appropriate food that comes right out of the same kind of language that's in the UN Declaration for Food Sovereignty that was at the behest of international indigenous people. So though that's another really amazing gem that comes out of this work that I think can lead us to some real action in the world. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Nan. Laura Ann, we'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be invited to be part of this panel, and it's with such an impressive group of scholars, and really just a treat to have the opportunity to read the book a little bit early and think about this. I am also appreciative to Nan for going first, and I think giving a really beautiful overview of the book. And also just that I'm very glad that these reviews are going to be published so we can all kind of go back to this discussion later. So hopefully I'll be adding on to what she was saying, but ultimately I think this is really a book arguing for the humanization of Latinx food workers. And Lori's making that case by seeing them as consumers of food, not just as producers of food, as Nan was just explaining. And by seeing them as both producers and consumers, right, this not only humanizes workers, all food workers, but we can better understand their desires and needs within the food system, right, and exactly to the point of not victimizing them, seeing them as actors and agitators in their own right, even in moments when it hasn't been historically represented, like in the H-2A guest worker program and the Bracero program. I think this perspective could not be more timely, of course, with the kind of potential policies coming down the line, and the kind of ironic processes of both excluding and also relying upon the Latinx community in our food system consistently. So I think what's coming is not going to be anything new, but something that people have conveniently overlooked for a very long time. So I'm going to go first into kind of what I think are the really unique contributions of this book, and then more into questions that I have or things that I'd love to kind of push further in our discussion. So I think this is just a beautiful narrative of resisting the invisibility and the devaluing of Latinx food and labor. And how these are really intertwined. So the ways that food and Latinx communities have persisted, resisted, but also reinforced kind of this binary between Latinx and white or European descendant culinary spaces and identities, which of course we know are not binaries in the United States, but ultimately unveiling and really challenging these authenticity tropes that function to really devalue both Latinx people and food at the same time, and seeing how these two things happen, you know, in a process together. I really appreciated, in particular, I come from the food studies kind of realm of things, and with a particular attention to labor in my own work and studies. And I really appreciated the new perspectives on entities that we've seen a lot of history on, like the United Farm Workers, as well as lesser known stories of Latinx food and labor and resistance, particularly the inclusion of the New York State farm worker law that just passed a few years ago, to understand that these are not just in history, but still happening today. I think very relevant to, you know, what's going on currently and what we should all be paying attention to is looking at, as Lori mentioned in the beginning, populations that have been kind of left out of different types of binaries on immigration and discussions of immigration, and particularly Caribbean and Haitian guest workers. I think we're going to see a huge increase in the guest worker programs within farm labor, and the more that we understand them historically, the better we are prepared to respond. But refocusing how we understand citizenship and Latinx food labor. So while I think a lot of historians have done this, it's just becoming more and more relevant. I also kind of something that Nana mentioned, but thinking about these marine spaces as well, or spaces of seafood production in the context of food studies is also pretty rare. Although I don't think she names it, I think that Laura's really drawing on what others have termed the agrarian imaginary. And I believe that Lori might be the first to draw on kind of a Northeastern marine imaginary, but the ways that consumers imagine seafood to be coming from kind of this white, European-looking man toiling on his boat against furious and cold waters in a very particular type of fashion. But in fact, it's done by Guatemalan and Salvadorian women and sometimes children, and kind of breaking through that imaginary or image of industries that consumers and the general population are not thinking about. She's also really willing to revisit and critique complex historical figures, such as Cesar Chavez in California, but also the culinary leader and entrepreneur Martinez in New York City. And so being willing to kind of go back to those histories and break them open a bit in how complicated they really are. I also really want to appreciate and highlight the geographical focus and the Northeast focus in particular. I think it's a really much needed shift in research and scholarship on Latinx foodways and labor, away from a focus on California and the West. So this scholarship, of course, has been growing, and she has cited, of course, those that have been doing it. I think this is the most comprehensive piece on this particular kind of population in this region, particularly her focus on food labor movements and resistance. And I know, you know, she probably had to dig pretty deep to find those, because we don't hear about them as much as other histories. So some things I had kind of questions on and wanted to push a little bit further. But this book is really centered on food and identity. And while it's about the workers, I think its strength is really in this intersectional framing of Latinx food workers. What I'd love to kind of unpack or hear from Lori or hear from others is kind of the labor framing a bit more. So I'll explain that a little bit. So from a labor perspective, I both appreciate and also want to complicate what I think can sometimes be a slippery slope presented between workers and owners, or laborers and entrepreneurs being put in the same type of bucket. So I see it in two ways, and I think probably Lori sees it in really complicated ways too. But on one hand, I think she connects Latinx restaurant owners and food vendors to workers, to food workers, making it visible that the value of food culture and the knowledge that people bring, that people don't just come to the United States as immigrant laborers, but people with food knowledge, people with kind of dreams and aspirations to starting restaurants. And, you know, I do this in my own work on Latinx farm workers that start their own farms. And I think it's a really valuable and important approach to changing this narrative of laboring bodies. And I think it's also important to note that the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is the largest umbrella organization looking at food chain workers today across these different sectors and organizing food chain workers, They also incorporate immigrant food vendors in their vision for labor justice, and kind of they're an organization, so they're not really making an argument, but by doing that, I think they see these small scale food owners, or food truck owners as more than just workers. And I think that Lori's work brings that same value of these very small scale entrepreneurs to the work. But I guess I also want to like complicate that too from a more traditional class analysis or labor organizing perspective. And again, it's something that I struggle with in my own work. But I guess the question of how does including food entrepreneurs like Martinez, who in this book is presented as imperfect from a labor perspective, she's a more upper class restaurant owner, and how does elevating her work in the context of labor help us with the political goal, right, of making Latinx workers and food cultures visible? And does it maybe make it harder for some workers to mobilize if the goal is right, to move into this other class of owner versus mobilizing workers? Not that it needs to be either or. Relatedly, I guess a key argument of the book, I think, is that the kind of exchange value of Latinx food and Latinx labor are linked, and I completely agree. But how do we contend with the fact that even when the value of Latinx food goes up, so the case of Martinez and others with kind of this top tier Mexican cuisine, the value of labor in that food system still does not go up, right? We're not paying necessarily people working in those kitchens or in those fields more when we see that food be valued at a higher rate. And how do we change that? So finally, the geographic focus, I think, as I said, I really appreciate it. Looking at this new space in terms of these questions in the Northeast and building on the work that's being done in the Northeast, where I'm located too. As a geographer, I guess I'd also love to hear, why telling stories from these different places and spaces really matter. And I know Lori talked about that a bit in the introduction. But as far as she talks, I think, in a really important way about the connection between Northeast grocery boycotts and the ways that they supported California grape growers during the UFW boycotts, but also points out the fact that the organizing never followed in the fields here in the Northeast, that we didn't see farm workers organize, as I think many people would have hoped to see. So I think especially in this moment of thinking through how to create more solidarity across geographical spaces, what can we learn from that? How do we learn from kind of maybe failures in creating geographic solidarities? And how do we use this history to think about the potential to change workers' lived realities? So there's a lot more I could say. I have more to write about when I put together my commentary, but it's such a rich and nuanced book, and I'm really appreciative for the opportunity to read it and to discuss it with all of you today.
Thanks, Laura Ann. Now we'll turn to Stephen Pitti.
Hi, everybody. Well, it's wonderfully easy to celebrate the publication of Lori Flores' Awaiting the Feast, and puzzlingly difficult to limit my comments on this great volume to just 10 minutes or less. And in the interest of trying to do that, I've written out most of my comments, and I'm grateful to say at least a few things here. I want to highlight roughly 5 of the central features that I see in this book that, in my views, make it so terrific and such an important volume. First, Awaiting Their Feast centers Latinx subjects as makers of regional and national history, something that Lori mentioned in her comments, and not simply as underpaid employees, regional residents subject to discrimination, or little recognized producers of foodways sold by others, although, of course, they are all those things, and we see that in this book. Instead, Lori offers us characters with names, with views, and with verb. We get this from the very first sentence on the very first page of the introduction, in which the author describes how in September of 2000, 3 men, Victor Estrada, Omar Gonzalez, and Cristo Gutierrez, entered a restaurant in small town Maine with the seemingly inviting name of Poncho's Cantina. Those 3 men weren't treated well, Lori tells us, and family members back in Texas ended up connecting them to the Mexican consulate, which in turn helped them to file a complaint with the state of Maine's Human Rights Commission. And I won't spoil that story because you all need to buy the book, so Lori gets those gargantuan royalty checks. But the importance of the Latinx people as makers of history, I think, is key throughout. Secondly, to me, the urgency and both the urgency and the evergreen quality of the topics that Lori explores come through very strongly throughout this text. Lori communicates the urgency in many ways, including by attending directly to the relationship between, say, food systems and anti-Latinx racism as it develops and our contemporary political struggles, all urgent matters. But something really important in my view is Lori's argument that we also consider key structural realities of the industries that she explores as seen by the Latinx workers themselves, how Latinx food workers have understood that they've been, as she puts it, quote, rendered invisible structurally in the food system by being tucked away in spaces like fields, warehouses, or the backs of restaurants. This, I think, is a matter that demands ongoing research and advocacy, of course, both in historical and contemporary domains. And in following the example of awaiting their feast, we should all be as attentive as Flores to the ways that invisibility has been, and so frequently still is, produced through spatial practices at the job site and well beyond the job site. Our eyes should be trained on the stockrooms, the back of the house workers, the farms with locked gates, the fishing boats far from shore, and other places like these, how they've changed over time and how the structural conditions that Latinx people have often recognized have remained in some ways constant over time. Which brings me to my third point, the matter of time as Lori handles it, an opportunity for me to say a word about both the chronological sweep of Lori's work, which begins in the 1940s and ends in the 2010s, and the ways that Lori suggests that we rethink periodization and how we can consider and talk about historical eras or orders over time. Now, on the face of it, it seems to me that Lori's offered us a book in 3 parts that's organized around the 1940s to the 1980s, part 1, around the period from the 80s to the 2010s, part 2, and then around the period from the 1990s into the 2010s, that's part 3. But we should note, I think, the blurriness of those dividing lines, the 1940s, the 1980s, the 2010s, as reminders that the author is making arguments both about hard turning points in history, but also about continuities and residual practices that in fact weren't dramatically transformed in any single year or any single decade. And she's raising questions about this. Perhaps they weren't transformed at all. And yet at the same time, I admire the ways that Lori isn't shying away from making arguments about change. The Bracero program, IRCA, the COVID pandemic, and other dateable events really did, we see here, reset industries, legal possibilities, the horizons of struggle, and the experiences of workers and consumers and others. Now, fourth, a word about how Flores, I think, helps us understand workers as full subjects and complex human beings, perhaps a kind of routine matter, but really not. This is indisputably, I think, an extremely fine piece of labor history, but it's certainly one in which we come to understand the subjects, the central protagonists, well beyond their workplace in the strictest sense. Even as we hear about how these folks picked or planted or cooked food for others or drove trucks and so forth, we also learn through Lori about how many of these people, as has already been said, struggled themselves to put food on their own tables. Even as Flores uses empirical data to represent the conditions of workplaces and homes, she also manages to describe how Latinx residents move beyond those places, often guided by their structural critiques of the industries themselves. For example, in the case of the UFW already noted, or when the people like the 3 men I mentioned at the outset appeal to their consulate and their state's commission. So I think we should see this book as one that contributes to ongoing efforts, important efforts, in labor history to take workplaces seriously while also understanding working class people's activities in other worlds of politics, of consumption, of production, and more. Consider, for example, a modest anecdote that Flores provides us in her 4th chapter on Latinx food workers in Maine, a moment in 2001 in which, she tells us, a man named Jose Soto, quote, opened a small Hispanic goods market called Bodega de Coqui near the offices of the Maine Rural Workers Coalition in downtown Lewiston, Maine. Now, Soto had been the founder of that organization, the Maine Rural Workers Coalition. And in opening a corner store, he then made products familiar to Latin American and Caribbean workers more readily available to those workers. Flores tells us here that, quote, the 1,200 Latino families who lived in Lewiston at the time were thrilled about the food selection, as well as their ability to make phone calls and send emails and money orders to Latin America. Bodega de Coqui became a beloved hangout for Latinos, Jamaicans, and other people of color. Now, to me, there's so much to say about this single passage in Flores's book regarding a site of food consumption, and both the information and the arguments that Lori provides here and elsewhere. In my reading, the author helps us, for example, to recognize, of course, the entrepreneurial nature of some workers and their supporters, to consider the aspirations and the pleasures that were often shared by diverse groups of Maine residents. Here it's Goya products, it's mangoes, it's plantains, and so forth. And to register both the local features of Lewiston life and the ways that many of this bodega's patrons were also emphatically invested in points elsewhere in other places, including to those whom they could call or email or wire money in Latin America from the modest bodega's countertop. Fifth and finally, I'll close by highlighting how unique and valuable it is that Flores provides us such a wide-ranging portrait of Latinx communities in the plural in this book. The they who are awaiting their feast here is multilingual, it's multinational, multiracial, multigenerational, differently gendered, urban and rural. And the author shows us their connections and their disconnections without backing away from the Herculean task of tracking diverse cohorts with Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, and Central American connections, not to mention relationships to New York and to Texas and to Florida and to elsewhere, as has been said. In my reading, this is not a romance of an entirely shared Latinx history at all, but it is a model of how careful attention to different parts of an industry within a bounded region by a skilled historian can yield new questions and new insights about cultural changes, about political alignments and conflicts, and social patterns of convergence and of divergence. Now, I began all this by noting both the urgency and the evergreen nature of this book, of Awaiting Their Feast, and I'll close right there as well. To me, this is a volume that should be read now, but also, fortunately and appropriately, will continue to guide students and teachers and researchers and policymakers and others for many years to come. And I think it'll do that because of how it foregrounds its Latinx subjects as actors, as makers of history, how it illuminates both changes and continuities in societal structures over decades and how these workers themselves saw those structures, how it explores workplaces, but also goes on to many other settings, and the ways that this book prompts us to understand social formations in the Northeast in new and exciting ways. This is a holiday gift of a book, Lori. Thank you for that. And I hope it'll be out in time. I'm talking to you, UNC. And it's certainly one that I'll be assigning and rereading, and a text that deserves all of our attention. So thank you, Lori, so much for this gift.
Thank you, Stephen. And now our final commenter, Bryant Simon.
Thanks so much. I guess it's never really great to go last, but I'll try. First, as I read Lori's wonderful new book, Awaiting the Feast, it actually brought me back to my hometown. I grew up in one of these places. I grew up in Vineland, New Jersey, a place shaped in ways I didn't really know, but by waves of farm workers and eaters, and I think importantly, by the way in which they were erased from so much of the landscape I grew up in. But I was also brought back again and again while I read Lori's book to two of my favorite lines about studying food, lines that I write all the time on the board when I do food studies classes. And the first is the simple line that food is good to think with. And the second line that I talk to my students all the time about is the idea that food is a highly condensed social fact. And I think these two basic ideas inform and animate Lori's notion that she introduces in the introduction of food studies, a notion that bridges Latinx, immigration, labor, and food studies. But this notion, I think, and this is kind of what I want to talk a lot about, also creates a map for Lori. And it's a map that pinpoints work and consumption, politics, and resistance constructed around the experiences broadly, as we've already seen, of Latinx food workers. And this map, I think, is really different from the maps created by other scholars of work. In fact, I would say more often labor historians, if we're thinking visually, create timelines more than they create maps. But Lori's map is also really different, as Nan pointed out, from the maps most often created by food studies scholars. And Lori notes these in her book, and food and drink scholars are familiar with the maps and close studies most often of a single commodity. There are a pile of books about cod, about bananas, about tobacco, and even a book not quite as rich as Lori's chapter about lobsters. But what these studies do is create a story that takes readers, again, as Nan pointed out, from the field or the sea to the table. And they show what happens in between. The work is almost always erased. I think that Flores does something obviously different in awaiting the feast. And it's not just that she includes workers. I think she creates a commodities chain that I would call a labor chain. And what she follows is workers, where they go and what they do. But she doesn't just follow them, she follows their bodies on the job, their bodies away from work, and as others have pointed out, their bodies at the table. And this focus on the body as a critical site, an intersection of social forces, allows her to make a number of key insights into labor history and food studies. First, by following bodies allows Flores, again, I think, to draw new maps of the Latinx experience. Maps that few of us have seen with dots, right, where Latinx people are living and working in New York City, New Bedford, Massachusetts, Vermont, Long Island, and along the coast of Maine. And so the thing I want to point out, and again, like the election is ringing in my head like others, is this is a map that shows like urban and rural spaces without, banging a drum and calling attention to them. And it makes the spaces between them both distant and close. And I think something, that labor historians can profit from. But also with this map and with her focus on bodies, and I would say emotion, we can see how Latinx workers fought for food that was, as Lori writes, and I think kind of in a beautiful framing, a remedy, quote, for racism, depression, and homesickness. And with this map and with her focus on bodies, we can also detect a new set of demands from workers and new relationships to transnational states. As food workers in the US reach out to the Mexican government, I love this passage, to stop wage theft, but also to push for better food and more food on their tables in the US. I mean, if there was ever a kind of notion of the transnational that where experience showed what theory does, I thought this was a kind of beautiful example of that. And we can see again, and I think taste and feel through Lori's method, the bitter ironies, again, that others have pointed out, of food workers going hungry while providing food. And at the same time, we see how Latinx workers are exploited, vilified, and pushed to the margins of maps, while the foods associated with them in their homelands move to the center of the nation's culinary production and imagination. We can also see through Lori's mapping of labor chains changing foodscapes. As workers settled into a place, they demanded they needed their own foods. And this created new markets and new opportunities. And I'm thinking here, and of the map that Jessie mentioned early on, of the emergence of tortilla factories in Brooklyn, and a whole new set of jobs and probably pretty complicated labor relations. Some workers we can see left the fields and factories, and Stephen pointed this out, this to provide this food. And this shift in supply satisfied some needs of Latinx workers. It also allowed for food adventurers, another group that comes onto the map here, a group of labor, a new group on the urban landscape of the 20th century, to seek out new tastes and perform new identities and draw their own food maps. And often these tastes spread by using and exploiting low-paid immigrant labor, but also, and I think this is really important and shown here, the creativity, recipes, and traditions of these same workers. Flores also notes, pushing back against some of the more hopeful work on food tourism, that changing maps of taste do not lead to a fairer and more just labor policy, or to a fairer and more just immigration policy for Latinx workers. And again, I think shows the kind of impoverished kind of the limits, right, of kind of food practices. Following workers and workers' bodies also shows how politics regulate and structure food systems and geographies. It creates and sustains, as Lori shows, labor markets and discrimination, criminalization, and the exploitation of Latinx workers. Mostly, politics make sure that Latinx workers remain in low-wage and dangerous jobs, and defined as for them only. And I think we see this at the end of the book, right, when we turn to COVID. And here I think you see something kind of important and dramatic, the way in which COVID created new vulnerabilities for Latinx workers, and how the government essentially locked the doors on them and made it impossible for them to avoid what was now deemed essential work and the dangers of airborne and airborne respiratory illness. But again, I think it was the status of Latinx labor kind of, as it had been constructed. But this focus on bodies also points to another crucial process, I think, in of modern food systems. And this goes back to the early 20th century, and that's the disappearing of labor. Labor is rarely acknowledged by food consumers, and others have pointed this out. And it's rarely acknowledged, Nan pointed this out, by a lot of food studies as we look at vital commodity chains. Instead, as Lori writes, workers and their bodies are, as Lori writes, are rendered invisible structurally. And I think that's the important word here, in the food systems, by being tucked away in spaces like fields, warehouses, or in the backs of restaurants, right? This is a system that manufactures and deliberately obscures and papers over where our food comes from and what the products of our industrial food supply entails in terms of harm and injury to workers, malnourishment to workers, environmental decay that workers often find themselves living in, and the link between dangerous calories and low wages, right? That by building this labor commodity chain, we see all of this. This is a system that only makes workers, Latinx workers, visible as immigrants and as outsiders. And I think actually the labor movement participates, the organized labor movement often participates in this, only as outsiders and as problems, right? This is the moments that their visibility happens. So I want to wrap up with a question and just a comment. And really my question is a kind of simple one for Lori, is how do you make your maps? How do you decide, really, why did you not write about Vineland? This is my real question. No, but how do you decide, what workers to follow and why? How did you make a decision to study a little bit more like workers in the fields and at the sea rather than restaurant workers. They appear a little bit. And I was curious why you didn't write a little bit more about the tortilla factory and just, I mean, in that, like, what happens inside of Latinx food businesses, and just a little bit about maps. But here's my final comment, and it's a comment with Tuesday's election, not surprisingly, rattling in my head. And I'm sure many of you thought the same thing late in the night Tuesday and early Wednesday morning, that perhaps it was the time to blow up the two-party system. And, you know, I think it's well past the stretch point. And so I was thinking about this while I was reading Lori's book, and I was thinking about a kind of suggestion that Michael Pollan made in an op-ed in 2012, where he proposed the formation of a dinner party, a kind of new electoral coalition to challenge the two-party system. And I think this is different, Nan, than voting with your fork. I'm imagining for a moment a political party that could reimagine community and solidarities and bring together a large cross-section of the people engaged with our meals and our foods together. And this could, again, bring together agricultural and restaurant workers, activists for a healthier food system, for sustainable food production, and the curbing of big ag, with consumers of food, you know, what they would call better food. And this could be, in some ways, if you think about it, a majority party dedicated to climate and social justice, to public health, to a sustainable environment, to regulations that actually regulate, and to workers' rights. And the template for this change, for what a new dinner party could look like, can be seen in Lori's book, a seeing that makes possible, that is built around the maps of workers' bodies and a labor chain of analysis. So thanks so much for the book, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Bryant, and thanks again to all our speakers. We are now going to take a 5-minute break. When we come back from that break, it's time for Q&A, and we'll do that for like 35 minutes, and then give Lori the floor to close out the meeting. So come back in 5 minutes, ready for Q&A, ready to ask questions. We'll start again at 3:15. And if Lori is back, let's see, I'm scrolling. Oh, okay, there you are, Lori. Good. I didn't want you to miss anything. Okay, so we want to turn now to Q&A. We realize, with the exception of our commenters, that most of you have not had a chance to read the book, so you're going on the conversation that's happened so far. But does anyone want to get started with a question? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and just offer the question, or you can put it in the chat. Any of those will work for us. Eileen, go ahead.
I'll get this going.
Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to reading this book very much. So I've been thinking a lot in recent years, as many of you know, about social reproduction and care work. And so my question really is how this tale fits into our notions of reproductive labor and the centrality of food producers for that. And then what happens in terms of their own social care work, their own creation of their communities, and how does age and gender fit into that?
Lori, yeah, I was
one
going
by
to ask
one?
you, would you like to take a few questions and then respond, or do you want to go ahead?
Maybe take 2 at a time,
Okay.
if we want to do that. If there's anybody now, otherwise I can go ahead and answer.
Cindy Hahamovich is ready, as I knew she would be. Go ahead, Cindy. Cindy, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
Go with restaurant owners as employers as well.
Cindy, we can't hear you. I think you're not, we can like hear you very softly. So it might be your headphones that are not hooked up.
Go to somebody else and I'll come back.
Anyone else?
I had a question about, I thought it was really, well, first of all, thank you to all the commenters as well as Lori. I mean, that was just really inspiring and thought-provoking in all kinds of great ways. Laura Ann mentioned the agrarian imaginary, and I thought that was an intriguing way to think about this. And I wondered if that was something you were thinking about, Lori, as you were writing and trying to disrupt that.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, I'm happy to bundle those two together. To Eileen's question, it's such a good one and one that I was constantly thinking about and trying to wrestle with. How do I do this? Because in each chapter, the landscape of people's families and social networks and social worlds looks so different. So depending on the time period and depending on the industry and depending on the place, sometimes there were scenarios in which the family as a framework was not working. There were some cases in which, I'm sorry, in which couplings were not the framework. There were some chapters in which solo migration was the framework and homosocial environments, like the Bracero program and like the migration division program of the World War II years. You saw different kinds of labor done for the purpose of nourishing each other, nourishing oneself, but nourishing the people around them, looked quite different. So in those earlier chapters about World War II, men were taking care of men. And men were advocating for things that, might have been looked at by government officials and commissary companies as, why are you complaining about this? You're being weak. You shouldn't be caring so much about what you're eating during the day. You shouldn't be caring so much that you have a kitchen to go home to at the end of the night in your labor camp. But they were, and they did, and they cared, and they made it known that they were caring. So I found it very impressive that in the World War II period, all these guest workers, not just in the Northeast, but all over the country, were saying, we need better food while we're working. We need food that reminds us of home, that connects us to where we came from. And this was a form of asking the United States to do better in a time where the good neighbor policy was being used to sort of frame the relationship between Latin America and the US when it came to food labor. And basically these workers were saying, you're not taking care of us in the way that you say you are. And the most basic way you can do that is by giving us better food. In another chapter about the United Farm Workers, that was a more family-centered framework because whole families traveled to be activists in the Northeast from California. And so there I was able to get more at age, gender, generation, sort of multi-generational households being developed between activists who had to live together in the Northeast when they were settling down to organize in Philadelphia or in Rhode Island or in Portland, Maine, or many, many other places upstate New York. So people were creating not just new arrangements, gender-wise and responsibility-wise, with the families they came with, but then creating families with fellow activists. And there's this great anecdote about the Grape House in Philadelphia that UFW women activists created with each other because they were the boycott team tasked with taking over what was previously a male-dominated organizing crew for the UFW in Philly and making it their own brand of food activism done from the vantage point of motherhood, taking care of children, feeding themselves. And I think that's what made the practice of fasting as a technique for the UFW so striking, because when mothers were doing it, it seemed riskier, it seemed more controversial. And it made grocery stores who were stocking non-union produce more villainous if they were letting a woman and a mother starve herself outside of their doors until something changed. And then in other chapters, reproductive labor, gender, and age sort of manifest in different ways when it came to child labor in the seafood industry, for instance. These are unaccompanied minors who are either placed with a sponsor or, if they're lucky, a relative or a family friend who already lives in the Northeast, in New England specifically in seafood. And so the ways in which children are taking care of themselves, taking care of younger children than them, trying to not only stay alive at work, but try to go to school at the same time and sort of failing at both things. It's very heartrending. And I'm glad, almost all of the commentators commented on the body in some way, on pleasure or the pursuit of even just moments of it in the eating of food. But when it comes to talking about the worker as a fuller person, I also tried to pay attention to the mind and the psychological state of so many people, whether they were adult men, adult women, children, the kinds of inner traumas that every generation of food worker experiences in this book is different, and it doesn't go away, sadly, and it's just manifesting in different forms. And so for children to sort of be going through integrating or trying to integrate as best they can into new communities, and yet still being so profoundly alone, I think that is a harbinger of just really, really destructive ways in which we're using the body of the Latinx food worker, because if we can now do it at such a young age, it's very, very disturbing, all under the guise of, well, we don't know where these children went, and it was the parents' fault for sending them in the first place. So judging and blaming the choices of families across borders before the work even begins is another sort of damaging discourse that it ignores and makes invisible a lot of realities for people. And then for I think it was Julie's question, right, about the imaginary. I guess I was seeing it, I was definitely thinking about it and sort of thinking about the trope of the Jeffersonian pastoral, this, especially when it comes to the Northeast and New England, because I think it's still mythologized as a very white space, despite demographic realities and despite what people might be seeing on a daily basis in terms of who's moving into states or communities. And so then mythologies around foodstuffs or commodities or artisanal products being the product of labor of white workers. I think that's the main thing I was trying to battle against, because particularly around this time of year, all of that is cloaked behind very attractive notions of, you can go apple picking and you can go cider tasting and you can, go up to Maine and get some balsam, sachets and wreaths and all of that stuff. And people get excited to consume these things without knowing the real, as the commentators pointed out, the real people behind the image that keeps on getting perpetuated. So the refusal of not just Northeastern states, but I think other states in the United States who kind of still put up a particular whitewashed picture of a commodity or an image of a commodity completely divorced from the hands that are actually making it and cultivating it, harvesting it, I think is the main problem I was trying to write against, so that people imagine the Northeast to be a very different kind of thing, and that statewide stories about states themselves get disrupted. And specifically because I lived in Maine at one point before I lived in New York, I saw it play out in a particular way. And so that always stuck with me and I always remembered it. And Vermont does it too with dairy and with different commodities there. So yes, that's what I had in mind. And though I didn't use the exact phrase, I'm glad that Laura Ann pointed out that that's one thing that I was trying to respond to.
Great, thank you.
So we're getting questions in the chat, Lori, so we can start with two of these and then we'll go down the list. So Veronica Martinez Matsuda says, perhaps Lori can talk about where she got the most pushback in writing this book. What, if anything, did people take issue with? And then Cindy Hahamovich asked, and I think this echoes something that Laura Ann brought up in her comments, I was wondering how the book deals with restaurant owners as employers and sometimes exploiters, as well as people who work really hard. How did that complicate your interviews?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. To Veronica's, the most pushback actually came during the research. I mean, people saw early versions of the writing, but thanks to, I vividly remember, and Steve was at this symposium, the Yale Agrarian Studies workshop, in which I was invited to, and you know, Jim Scott and the other members of that workshop were so great, and Steve included, because they were the ones who reminded me first and foremost when I showed them an early version of Maine labors, and I framed it as like a calendar year of work for somebody in Maine, that they reminded me to look at a worker's world beyond just the things that they were doing for other people. So I guess I wouldn't count that as pushback that discouraged me. It actually just motivated me throughout the whole piece to be like, don't do that. Make sure you're not doing that. Make sure that you're sort of talking about what the worker goes home to or wishes they were coming home to or is eating or wants to be eating, and thinking about, and these moments in which some organizations like the Maine Rural Workers Coalition were blaming laborers for not sticking with their membership and organizing with them after their own fights were won. It's because they were worried because a hurricane hit Central America and they were checking on their families and then they had to move on to another job. So it was like very practical things like that that could help explain what was happening in the labor sphere. So by paying attention to the personal, it allowed me to kind of say more about the political. And so they helped me think about that. And then the other thing that I got pushback on was early on when it came to the readers for UNC, and I'm so grateful for the anonymous reviewers who helped me. And they kept pushing me on the Caribbean worker question and Blackness in Latinx history and Latinx labor and what difference that was making, and talk about it more. And I'm so glad that they just kept pointing out the missed opportunities earlier on where I should have been doing that. And so I really, really tried to correct the places where I could be looking at something else, looking at someone else, looking at a different sort of element of an industry, or putting people in conversation together, putting characters together in chapters that I was kind of at first explaining away their lack of solidarity rather than trying to figure out why, or why are we expecting it to happen? And structurally, the reasons for which, a lot of Haitian and Caribbean workers were structurally by the employers themselves set apart from, say, Mexican or Tejano or other types of laborers in a particular industry, but also how the workers themselves were separating out based on racism, colorism, language, generation, right? Because some older workers were overlapping with newer workers being brought in to sort of depoliticize the entire environment and to disorganize memories of labor activism. So I think those two areas were the areas where other people really helped me strengthen what I did. And by no means do I think I did everything they might have hoped that I might do, but I went a lot further with that feedback. And I'm really, really grateful for it. And then to Cindy's question about restaurant owners as employers, Zarela Martinez was such a important and interesting figure, and one, I mean, talk about pushback. A lot of people were like, why is she in this book? Because she was just so different from everybody. But the difference people kept pointing to was her class. And I just didn't think that should disqualify her altogether, because I thought to myself, well, why not show that no matter what class you might be in, that you're still considered one of the creatives I talk about in this book, like people who create, people who make the Northeast, and people who kind of make this sort of dual national obsession flourish, and the devaluation too. So Zarela Martinez, despite being a very privileged, sort of middle to upper class Mexican-born immigrant chef, who came in and eventually owned her own restaurant. I think what I was trying to show with that was no matter whether she thought she was above the politics, she was still hemmed in by a growing national discourse about Mexican food needing to be cheap. And ironically, in the 80s, we were paying more for a Mexican meal in a restaurant than we do now because it was more scarce and more prized, and it was treated like often a fine dining experience in ways that, because of the plethora of options now, people just sort of think it should be fast, it should be casual, it should be cheap. And so she wasn't immune to that. And she was very discouraged that her business started gaining less profits because of, the food truck down the street or the food cart, or she said young people today just don't want to pay as much for a Mexican meal anymore. And so performing an oral history with her and staying in touch with her, still up until now, we still send messages back and forth. I think she was a complicated figure that at first, when I interviewed her, at first with my research in the archives, she appeared one way. And then I interviewed her and I kind of was a bit more gentle with her as a historical subject. And then the reader said, you're being too gentle, get back to critical. And so oral history, I think, is we have to admire people who do it. We have to admire people who take it on, because not everybody does, even if they can, because it is a very arduous practice in balancing and ethics and sort of making sure that you are sort of corroborating things properly. And I know this, and many other people on this Zoom do it themselves. And it's a very complex process. And I felt, and maybe I can save more of this for later, but to Bryant's point about, well, why not more restaurant workers? I did it, a little bit with Zarela and her world in the 80s, a little bit in COVID, but didn't kind of thread it through. And I thought to myself, I kind of got intimidated away from that because it would take a lot of personal investment in people. And I didn't want to be so extractive to visit a place one time, be like, what's going on here? And then sort of like leave. And I thought to myself, I've seen so many good books about restaurant labor, and they stayed in it for years with these people. And for practical reasons, I just thought I I can't do that. Like I just won't have the time, and I won't actually feel like I'm giving anything in that relationship. And I didn't want to be too New York centric, I guess, because New York was coming up a ton in the book, and I didn't want to make it seem like it was just a book about New York. But that would be the only way I could do it on a practical level. So all of those things were complicated. All of those things taught me a lot at the beginning about what I should be looking out for, and so I'm so grateful for that early feedback and pushback.
We have two more questions popping up in the chat. One by Sonia Hernandez. She said, loving this conversation. Congrats on the book. Can you talk a bit more about how food workers' activism, in particular migrants here in the US, had or may have had an impact on movements in their countries of origin, and or if these workers were influenced by movements abroad? And then Nate Holdren asks, he writes, Bryant mentioned the book discussing how some people's lives and experiences are rendered structurally invisible. And Lori mentioned this as well in the Q&A a moment ago. Lori's wonderful JAH article on Latinx forestry workers touches on similar themes. I'd love to hear more about anything related to this theme of the making of partial invisibility, whether in relation to the book or for labor history generally.
Thank you both for these great questions. To Sonia's, I think it was different for different industries. In seafood, Caribbean workers, previous relationships to water, the sea, fishing, definitely was informing not just the ways that they might have been treating their work in the seafood industry in the United States, but throughout the calendar year, if they were working in, and this is where Vineland actually comes up, if they were working in vegetables or other industries in New Jersey in the Garden State, they were using sort of their previous knowledge and knowing that knowledge was valuable about sea or land work in vegetables to inform the ways that they organized or tried to create proto-unions that didn't quite get off the ground, but they were asking for, things not just like better food, but also reduction of pesticides, stop killing us in the fields, and being aware of environment and being aware of labor hazards. So I would say it was more Puerto Rican and other Caribbean workers who were doing that in seafood and sort of creating unions that the UFW at first thought was a good idea to sort of collaborate. And then very quickly, Chavez got out of the game and just didn't want to associate with them anymore because they were too radical for him, that they were more open to more militant tactics. And he backed out of that pretty quickly, and so did the entire organization. But I just wanted to point that out as that was going on in the 60s and 70s. And then just didn't get off the ground in the same way as the UFW, which got a lot of media attention relative to these other smaller moments of organizing. And then I would say for other populations and other industries, so for instance, in Vermont dairy, I wouldn't quite call this labor organizing in the way that we might expect when it comes to a formation of organizations or alliances in a formal sense, but the way that dairy workers, which include some women but are mostly men, the way that they arrange their labor is by having family or friends in Mexico or in Central America ready to take their position at the milking parlor if they ever want to go home. And so I think the preservation of a job by arranging a substitute for an employer who then doesn't have to look for one is a way that workers preserve positions, maintain a relationship with an employer they can keep coming back to, and in some cases asking their employer to pay their future smuggling fee to get them back up to still milk. So I found that super interesting, that people were using networks and knowledge and strategic moves and reasons they were giving their employer for how they were making their lives easier. I saw that as a very active mode of interacting with one's employer and workplace rather than a passive, well, I really want to go home, but I don't know how to do that. And so I just won't, and I'll stay in the US for years and years, which is what a lot of people have to do. And their lives become pretty constricted and slow down in ways that when I saw with other workers what they were arranging and setting up and doing, it was quite interesting. So that's what I took as in countries of origin, the value that they were putting on what they do offer when they come to the US. I think a lot of people assume migrants will be desperate and migrants will do anything for any wage, but actually there's a lot of smart, strategic things that workers are doing to make sure that their job stays safe in the United States. And then to Nate's point in question, the JAH article that came out on forestry workers, I think a lot of people were kind of confused why I made that turn. And it was precisely because forestry is a sector that people turn to when other food-related economies kind of slow down for the fall and winter. What I think is in common between what happens with pineros, whether it's the Northeast or the Pacific Northwest or the Deep South, anywhere where Latinx workers are working in timber and the paper industry. The thing that has in common with other types of food labor is invisibility and is different layers of historical amnesia that industries intentionally create in order to scatter memories of labor-related trauma and labor-related mobilization. So newer waves of workers brought in as a form of intentionally accelerating ethnic succession in a workforce. So if a food workforce or the timber workforce used to be heavily Mexican, and then Central American workers are brought in specifically because they know less about the industry and they know less about how to politically mobilize within it. That sort of thing is happening along with Haitian workers, along with new indigenous populations of workers coming in. All of that is done by industries and many employers to disorganize workplaces and to make people feel alone. And to make people feel like they just have to put their head down and work, and you don't have time for a union, and you don't have time or ability to act in conjunction with other people. So I think that along with invisibility, amnesia when it comes to labor-related traumas in the workplace that could have sparked more mobilization, amnesia when it comes to record keeping, archiving, workers by name, by life, by presence in an industry. It doesn't happen, and that's for a reason. Many levels of government don't cross-check violations when it comes to labor violations in various industries, although it would be very possible to do so. So I think amnesia is another concept that I used more in the JAH article, but that can certainly apply here.
So we have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has one. And if not, oh, okay. Dan, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to engage around this one thing that, because some of the stuff that I didn't have time to say engages with what Laura Ann had brought up. And I think that this really interesting piece of including, which you have commented on now, Lori, including Martinez and the high-end stuff for chefs. I just thought about, and some of you are probably familiar with this, that Sean Sherman, the sous chef in Minneapolis, he has a high-end Native American restaurant, Lakota Food, in downtown Minneapolis. It's very expensive. And it's a really interesting, it's a different moment. It's not the 80s, it's the past decade, but I was thinking about this in like he says, why are there no Native American restaurants? And it's because these are people without a nation. These are people without a culture, without a civilization, right? And if you look at in that parameter, right? And if you look at why elite food emerged in the era of nationalism, it was Italy and France, and these countries creating a cuisine out of what was peasant food, right? They're creating an elite cuisine out of food that women made in order to say, this is our civilization. That's the Apatarai stuff. And so I think it's really interesting to see somebody like Martinez or somebody like Sean Sherman saying, okay, I'm going to play in that sandbox. I'm going to use kind of national things that we've, inherited from nationalism. And I'm going to engage in this kind of nationalist capitalist project to make this food more visible. And it's super contradictory. So I guess I just wanted to kind of say, I think it's a very contradictory space, but what Sean Sherman says is he's like, but I'm decolonizing the palate. I'm going to serve buffalo and wild rice and, indigenous food. So there's a really interesting mix of different kinds of stuff. So I guess I just wanted to kind of raise that and we don't actually have that many totally clean tools. And so I wanted to say really thank you for some of that and that we see some of these discourses around food sovereignty intersecting in really interesting ways now with things that labor historians tend to embrace, like super expensive elite food. So I guess I want to thank you for including that contradiction, because I think it's something that while people might have to struggle with it, I think that's a good struggle. And I don't know if you have anything else that you wanted to kind of say about that.
Yeah, what I will say is another reason I included Martinez in the book is because she doesn't act the way people would expect a Latina immigrant chef to act. And that certainly speaks to the present moment where people, I think, homogenize Latinx communities and expect solidarity and expect you will all have the same politics and expect that you would be concerned about, certain people, that she just simply said and said it quite explicitly, like, I am not into the Chicano movement. Like, I don't identify as one. I don't care about engaging with that rhetoric and discourse, even though, Chicano feminism in the 80s was what people might have expected her to engage with. But so I included her in there and other little sprinkles of figures that are business owners, but not always. Some people are just workers who don't engage in the same sort of solidarity moves that other people were making. So I did want to complicate it with that, but then still also critique Martinez for practices that food studies critiques, which is taking recipes from women with less privilege and taking recipes from people with less privilege and replicating them in a capitalistic structure in cookbooks that then you get paid for. And people go to your restaurant and they buy your merch. And so what do we do with that continuing imbalance of currency and, both currency in the media and financially speaking? What do we do with that continued practice of recipe taking, modifying recipes, getting inspired by recipes, but then how do we give proper credit and compensation to people in very different places with much, less privileged positions? How do we still make statements about things like decolonizing palates while at the same time making clear to people that there are dynamics of labor underneath me and underneath this mission and underneath this enterprise? to remain critical of. And this is where food journalism, I mean, it is getting better, but journalism is one sphere we haven't mentioned really, and food critics and the way that they talk about food. And I think younger food critics and more food critics of color are starting to talk about labor systems and mentioning laborscapes when they talk about desirable places in food, but can still do better. I think it just can become part of the more of the food review discourse that we talk about work.
So Leon, I see you have a question. So Leon Fink, and then Lori, if you want to shift from answering Leon into your closing comments, we can do that. Go ahead, Leon. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I think you
Yep.
can hear me now. Yeah. Lori, I just wanted to say first, I'm sorry that I was just got back in time for the Q&A from another appointment, but I had the benefit of reading the manuscript a few weeks ago, so I'm quite aware of the richness of your study. But forgive me if I'm treading on somebody else's comment or question here. But I couldn't help but the aftermath of the election raise a question to you that is at least is concern to me, and I'm sure everybody on this network, which is, I mean, your work, like a few others, shows the very richness and the complexity of the Latino foodways and the centrality of Latinos, Latinx workers in the whole chain of food production and consumption in the US now. But why do you think that story and its complexity and its actual positive contributions to our culture and society and economy doesn't get told? I guess that's my question. Why is it, even in the face of the most ridiculous and dangerous narratives of like Trump Vance narratives about Springfield, Ohio, that the most people can do is say, well, that's a terrible exaggeration. You know, that's not typical. Why is that the best that it seems that the culture can produce? I mean, why is it that there's not a positive narrative that's a popular one about Latinos and in relation to the economy? I'm wondering, given your immersion in it and these communities, what kind of response might you offer to that question?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the first part of the Zoom, a lot of the commentators and I were talking about this structural invisibility in the food.
Oh, I'm sorry
system.
then to repeat.
No, I mean, you're not. In a way that this is a way I can expand upon it further, is that I think a reason why a more positive story doesn't exist is because people don't see it in front of them, I think. So in a lot of spaces in food production, but then also food service and the way in which we procure food for ourselves, in writing this book, I was seeing things that I just wasn't seeing before in industries that I just, especially in seafood and especially in dairy and especially in some basic ways that, I didn't know where my own food was coming from. I think a lot of people, if they're not making the effort to really think about workforces in everything from restaurants to food delivery to truck driving to warehouse work, to all these subscription food services. If any of us subscribes to like a food box or a meal plan, like all of these things are done by heavily Latinx, Caribbean, and undocumented labor. So I think because of the ways the food industry obscures workscapes in order to preserve a feeling of pleasure for the consumer, for the diner, for the eater, for the grocery shopper, for the ways in which we select our food and consume it and eat it with either alone or in a social setting. I think that is what allows a lot of people to escape the realities of the work behind the food and then rely on lazier tropes and lazier stories and more visceral story, or that can hit a more visceral point about a Latino threat. I think continuing waves of migration that are now coming from different places, and because they're now different, people are even more sort of unwilling to kind of hear the stories behind what is driving movements of people from Central America, from indigenous communities in Mexico, from Haiti, from the Caribbean, from other places, is because those people are now lumped in with just a vague threat at the border that's not really concretized, but it's just hitting a place in people's mentalities that operates on a scarcity mindset. There's not enough to go around. We can't handle this. This is too much for us. When in reality, the whole reason our food system has continued to operate that the way that it has, and if you think food prices are high now, they will just get higher if we take away, who have we been depending on for the last century in order to have multiple links in the chain work. So I feel like a lot of people are not getting the story put in front of them intentionally by the food industry, but I also think people are not willing to hear those stories loudly enough. They're kind of turning the volume down on those and turning the volume up on simpler ideas of this is a crisis, this is
No,
too many people.
just one thing. Would you agree with me though that just so if you think back on this campaign, there was no counter narrative produced? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just by the people demonizing them, but there was no positive counter narrative produced.
Yeah, and that wasn't existent at all. I was super scared and disappointed, and I had a really bad feeling after I saw the debate in which both candidates were playing into a Latino and immigrant threat narrative. I just thought, well, this isn't going to improve anything because there's no concrete counterweight to what is simpler for people to hear, what is more scary for people to hear, and the other side was not doing anything to really put into concrete terms what our nation actually runs on and what it's actually powered by.
Thank you.
So maybe in the final minute, I'll just say a little bit about what the book tries to point to at the end, but I guess we've already hit on it a bit, which is this dichotomy that we have, and our commentators pointed it out today, between the producer and the consumer, between politics and pleasure. And I really think that the politics should not be just reserved for the worker, who should remain pleasureless in foodscapes. And meanwhile, the consumer should not be the one experiencing all the pleasure at the end of the line and be apolitical or, having to avoid politics in all of this. So I hope what the book does for people is disrupt, binaries and expectations and the ways that we think how food can be pleasurable. It's not that I want to argue we should all stop enjoying our food, but what I want us to do is not only allow for a historical examination of how workers have needed and wanted to enjoy their food too, but allowing more of that pleasure to be possible by treating them better in the work that they do.
Well, thank you so much, Lori, for sharing this really rich research with us. And I just want to remind everyone that you can pre-order Lori's book, Awaiting Their Feast, and you can get a discount right now, 30% off. The link is there. And also I want to remind you, if you haven't, you can join Lacha. Cindy put the link in the chat as well. And so just again, join me. I wish we could all offer applause to you, Lori, in person, and join me in thanking our wonderful commenters as well. This was a really wonderful conversation, and it will be published in a roundtable in Labor. So watch for that.
Thank you all so much. Everybody on the Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really great. Thank you.